It's mad that it's taken us 3 albums this month to get into the new Queens of the Stone Age. But here we are, in Times New Roman, the new album from another of the great titans of 21st century rock music, obviously friends of Dave Grohl, former bandmates, frequent collaborators. It's nice to have, I think, this Queen's album here after both the Avenged and the Foos ones, where we've gone really, jumped around there, because there's almost a happy medium, I think, with Queens, because...
I was going to say, this is like...
Yeah, because Queens of the Stone Age have definitely got a very clear and consistent identity as a band. They seem to know what they are pretty well. But I think there's always just been a strangeness in their music, and an organic sense of how to kind of stretch that and evolve that has kept them more consistently vital and engaging than many rock bands who are heavily associated with, the 90s or the early 2000s. Elliot, I believe we were having a conversation around when we spoke about the first single on this album, but I mean, I have to say that, again, unlike the band we've just spoken about, or say, I mean, most of the grunge bands of the 90s who are kind of still around, etc., bands who are generally viewed as being kind of like, there's a certain peak, and they might just sort of hit something really good every now and then if they're on it. Queen's albums still feel like creative sort of events in my mind, because even if they're not making songs for the deaf anymore, they're kind of part of an ongoing trajectory of albums that has never really been broken to me.
Yeah, I mean, every time a Queen's record comes out, like you say, it does feel like an event. It does feel like another sort of part of the saga, in a sense. And like you say about most bands from the 90s and early 2000s in this style, you kind of have the classics, and then the later stuff, you just sort of... It doesn't feel all that important to the legacy. But with Queens, they still have talking points far into the career. Each record feels like it has its defenders and detractors. And part of that, or that is at least part of what makes each one feel so significant.
Yeah, and I think for me, I'm actually looking to them as kind of album experiences more than I am like, oh, give us 2 bangers for the set list, like most of their peers kind of are. Like, I think this album is better as a album statement than it is like, offer us some bangers for the set list, right? That's kind of where Queens are. And
I think so, yeah, that's where they exist.
Yeah, I think, like Sam, you weren't there when we had that conversation, but I mean, I do slightly fear what you might say about Queens of Stone Age in that regard, because I think much like a band like AFI, for example, there are naysayers out there who maintain that they haven't been up to much since however many albums ago, and it feels like you have to sort of be part of the cult of Queens of the Stone Age to really be into what they're doing.
Villains is the only one I don't really like. That's the only one I'm kind of like, about, and I find this album, like you said, it's quite a nice happy medium. I don't know how I can say nice about this record. I think this is this is an ugly, uncomfortable record. Like, and I think that's one of the things that is one of the strengths about it. Like, this is a nasty, like, again, sonically, it's quite like hip shaking rock and roll in a lot of ways. With big grooves, big bouncy riffs. But underneath it all, underneath that kind of pure surface level of like Queen Stones, writing big riffy rock songs like they can do in their sleep with kind of big stonery bits and all that. This is an ugly, uncomfortable record, and it's kind of what makes it quite fascinating.
Yeah, like I fucking loved Villains. I rinsed the shit out of it at the time. I thought that was a great example of a band trying something that actually did like accentuate a part of their sound that was very natural for them. I think it resulted in some knockout singles. Like, they should never stop playing the way they used to do. But it was also an album that was more kind of dynamic in its ebbs and flows, and I think it got credit for as well. They were sensational on the fucking touring cycle for it. Like, I saw them twice on it, and it was 2 of the most, like, take your head off shows I've seen from, like, an arena touring rock band. Equally, I think Like Clockwork is one of their best ever records, and in time...
Like Clockwork is one I would put up there as one of my favourites, yeah.
And in Times New Roman, I think, almost brings us kind of full circle, something like that, because, I mean, I didn't realise up to this point, but with the release of this album, they've described it as the conclusion of a trilogy, with Like Clockwork, Villains, and now this. When Villains came out, I did obviously note the similar artwork and kind of aesthetic style to Like Clockwork, but apparently it's very self-consciously. These albums have now been tied together, and this is another album that has been in gestation for a while and has been coloured by its fair share of negativity along the way, because I mean, I have to say personally, as a long-time really big fan of Queens of the Stone Age, it's really nice to get an album that we can talk about from them instead of like a flurry of headlines, because there's loss in here, the likes of Mark Lanegan, obviously from the Queen's camp, among others, Taylor Hawkins again, with a kind of close relation between those bands. Most publicly in the Queen's case, there was a really ugly and unfortunately highly publicised court battles going on in terms of Josh's marriage, custody battles for children, that kind of thing. And then to top it off, he's just revealed, like in this past week with the release of this album, that he underwent surgery for cancer during that creation of the album as well. So it's been a really heavy few years for Josh. And with that trilogy idea, I am kind of reminded of the circumstances surrounding Like Clockwork, which was at the time a quite, dark and vulnerable album for Queens. One of the things that was going on there was Josh was kind of held up in a hospital bed following another instance of surgery. if Villains was the kind of like free-spirited fling in the middle of that, In Times New Roman feels like it's kind of dug back down into some of the more kind of nasty and more fraught underbelly of these particular records. I mean, it's self-produced. It is... I mean, it's a decently fresh take, so I've been listening to this record for a week. I'm really enjoying it. I was walking around London listening to it the day after Depeche Mode, which is always good, I think, for a Queen's record, just to you can get because the real focus on like feel in their records. It's always nice to see like how the grooves take you when you're out and about. To me, there's a lot of that kind of slinky dive bar stuttering kind of feel that you get on some of the heavier cuts on like Clockwork, stuff like Keep Your Eyes Peeled, that kind of thing. It is quite a
I'd say it's the heaviest record they've done in a while, I think, as well. Like,
yeah,
to the sonic level.
I think, like again, because I think this record was largely sort of written and recorded and everything before he had the cancer bout. Like Clockwork was a record more about sort of that kind of fragility and mortality in a way. This record does feel more kind of, I think, understandably fraught and ugly, as you put it.
Yeah, I think like because that's cool. I do think it still follows a lot of the ideas that were laid out on Villains. I think it just mangles them a little bit more and just makes them less kind of fun and free spirited. I mean, like lyrically, like that's one of the things that is going to leap out to you. But I think that's cool. These are still good Queen Sound songs. My feelings of this record are definitely a little conflicted as to how much I enjoy the overall experience. But it's definitely a worthwhile kind of like album to immerse yourself in.
Yeah, I think for me, I'm sort of in the same camp as you, so I think Like Clockwork is great. I think Villains, the first 8 minutes or so, are wicked, and then the rest of it I've more or less forgotten. And I was relieved going into this, like listening to this record for the first time, that it is such an honest Queen's record, or Josh Homme record even, because, we're doing the Charleston in your divorce courts, so it would just be dishonest of a Villains Part 2 after the public nature of what's happened to Josh and the tragedies that have befallen them, etc. I wanted to like this record more than I did because it's really nice to hear. It's nice to hear more rumble in the Queen's engine again, but I found most of the songs sort of just a bit forgettable. Not bad, but slightly sort of non-events.
I've been really enjoying this album, like, more and more with every listen, and the songs have jumped out at me more in that sense, but it's not about... I think the Queens are, again, they're the rare band of their size where their albums aren't really about, like I said, coming out with those couple of knockout singles or whatever, and they're more the sort of strange thing you get locked into, because, again, like, Obscenery, they do awkward grooves really well.
Yeah.
Like, that kind of fluidity out of stiffness, in a way, if that's not, an oxymoron. I think, in a credit to John Theodore as well, who has been Queen's drummer longer than anybody else now, and particularly his records that he played on have that sort of feel to them that he's really let into, and how that kind of tom part accent that like part of the central beat. I think that is so Queen's and so engaging to the ear, and I think there is this inherent swing and groove in the band that makes these kind of patterns that they just lock into together. So, again, I'm quite a rhythmically minded person. I think that's why Queens are one of my favourite bands of sort of the bands of their size, because it's not just about, again, the Foo Fighters heart on sleeve chorus approach or whatever. It's about this fucking strange, oddball, like, basic hard rock beats have been turned into something that is a lot more kind of demanding. You have to actually concentrate on them a lot more.
It's really seedy and kind of like it kind of slinks on, but yeah, you're right, rhythmically way more intricate, even if the riffs are, you just kind of like hear, like, take like Royal Blood, for example, is that a band who clearly like want to do like the sort of Queens of the Stones riffs. They're so much more, they're so much less demanding.
They could never
like,
write Time and Space from this record,
which
is such a strange and intricate pattern. It's almost like a kind of like polyrhythmic idea or something. Or there's that little like chirping pattern of 3 over which that main 4/4 groove gets played. And for me, the kind of the creativity and the chemistry of getting these ideas flowing in the practice room in the songwriting sessions, I think it's just beyond an awful lot of the bands on their kind of commercial records. You get these like, weird, uncanny, like wailing lead guitar lines on the record, strange looping vocals, all of this kind of seedy, hallucinogenic stuff that you can count on in a Queen's record. That has always made them feel to be like this like freaky, bad trip rock and roll band that have somehow kind of infiltrated the mainstream. And that's what I'm still getting out of their records like these.
I don't think you still get that, like I said, that bad trip thing. Like, Time and Place is such a weird one because, like, there's no hooks in the vocals, but, like, and you're right, the riffing's weird, but it's catchy and infectious.
Yeah.
And that's where I think, again, a lot of the hooks come from on this record is the guitar playing, even if it's not straightforward, and that again just adds to the weird characteristic of the band.
So I really like the kind of awkward gait that a lot of these songs go at. Like, it's not something that other bands do. Like the Royal Blood comparison is spot on. Like, they would not be capable of playing in that sort of off-kilter style. Like, Negative Space going in and out of the traditional beat, Made to Parade, sort of ironically, feels like a sort of song to strut to, but for someone who can't really walk. Do you know what I mean? It doesn't sound like it's all quite there. And a lot of the album sits at that sort of tempo, and I like that. I like that flavour. I do think the album would benefit from maybe just a couple times where it locks in maybe in a more traditional way. In the way that, like, Feet Don't Fail Me Now is like a minute and a half of this weird build, and then when it locks in, it just feels like the best thing ever. I think this album would, generally speaking, be improved by a couple of moments like that along the way to kind of reward you for paying attention. I do like the sound, but I think, in a way, the fact that it's weird and different, that alone isn't really a flavour that can sustain it for me across the 10 tracks.
Yeah, I kind of agree with what you're saying in terms of, like, this is not one of my favourite Queen's records, and I think it's the fact that it doesn't have that kind of real, almost the star power is slightly sort of subdued on this record in favour of that heavy, weighty kind of feel in that kind of slightly nastier element. And I think, again, if it did that kind of thing, for me, it's more like that would be what would take it up from, like, you know, an album I'm really, really enjoying to, like, one of my favourites of the year, you know? But it's still, I'm just sorry, that does lock me into an album so well when the ideas are just so consistently kind of ear-catching. And the moments when it does, I think there's real conviction in it, because, like, again, in, like, Obscenery, when he does that, like, hurrah, the kind of the hook, he's, like, really bitter and kind of spat at you. And the one that really does that is the point where it locks in the most, which is Paper Mache, which is, I mean, instrumentally, it's the most, like, vintage Queens of the Stone Age song they've done in forever.
It's like the hit on the record. Yeah, it's so vindictive and I mean, just genuinely spiteful.
Instrumentally, it's the most, like, pure, like, 1998 debut almost Queens of the Stone Age. Like, they don't revisit it in that pure form that often. Like, the last track that was this sort of, like, simplistic stoner rock riff like that, like you're going to, like, Little Sister or something. But it's so killer. They do that stuff better than anyone, that kind of cyclic stoner rock chord progression. Like, I've been addicted to this song this week. It just hit such a spot for me. But there is that venomous delivery from Josh on it that, like, actually takes you aback with how kind of vicious it is. Because I think, you know, again, you're used to a lot of these sort of rock star tabloid stories having a certain level, I guess, obfuscation to them when it comes to actually dealing with them in the songwriting and on record.
When I think of Queen of the Stone Age, I think of them as being quite an obtuse band who, you know, lyrically are, like, I mean, you still get that on, like, Obscenity movies going, like, voyeurism jism. Like,
yeah, again,
like, I think of Queen of the Stone Age as that kind of, like, the lyrics don't make much sense and you kind of got to dig into them. This is one where it's kind of like, no, this is, you know, laying in, no subtlety on it. He is fully, like, the most subtle is the paper machete kind of metaphor, but even then it's like he's still singing stuff that is very clearly pointed at a certain person in his life in a certain ongoing thing. And again, I don't want to, you know, dig into what he's about Azar. That's like a whole other ugly story.
But it just
really
fucking stings you, doesn't it? It's like, whoa,
yeah.
And while the song, you know, rocks as hard as anything they've done in a while,
it's jarring, and I think that is almost like a deliberate thing of writing their most kind of freeing, like, fun rock and roll song on the record. That is also one of the most bitter, like, nasty and bitter. Yeah,
I think it would be sort of jarring from anyone, particularly from Josh Homme, who was just his whole career just cooler than cool. Like, do you know what I mean? It's almost like that video of is it Snoop Dogg when he's playing that game and he gets really mad? He goes, "For fuck's sake!" And the whole character just dismantles. Like, it's hard to imagine anything rattling Josh Homme or Josh Homme. But when you listen to that song, you realize, oh, there's a person behind this kind of slicked back hair and cigarette and Gretsch guitar. There's a guy there who can be rattled and brought to that level of rage. And I think my favourite part of the record is the final run of tracks, but Paper Mache might be the best sort of single song on the record. I do think that works excellently.
Yeah, I think what the Peephole say as well goes off in that kind of more playful kind of area, kind of similar role to something like Head Like a Haunted House on Villains. It's almost like this sort of hysterical quality of, like, you know, sort of fucked up, like, headless chicken psychobilly almost kind of.
Well, it's trying to do the most
sensibility.
Overt callback to 50s rock and roll. That whole thing. Like, I mean, the anecdote that people say is such a, like, blatant reference to 50
but like when it
and
gets
all that,
when it locks into that, tonight is the night, it's so cool, and it's something you want to be in on. I do think again melodically the record is more subtle and it's less focused on writing these kind of runaway singles. It's maybe like again, so Era Vulgaris has always been a Queen's record which you look at sort of slightly oddly, in that it's got like a couple of really standout singles that are so different to the rest of the record that is mostly like kind of locking into bizarre sort of robot rock kind of grooves and stuff. But this has more of a kind of psychedelic colour on top of that, because like stuff like Carnavoyeur and Sicily and Made to Parade, do they have the most memorable choruses in the Queen's pantheon? No. But are they like involving songs to listen to for what they do elsewhere? For me, I absolutely think so, because they are jammed with fucking weird, bizarre, like, what's going on there? Kind of colours and tones. There are songs that are melodically strong, again, that have this kind of wistful quality. I think, Emotion Sickness as the lead single, it's not quite a banger, like, the way you used to do, but it has really unmistakable, like, jagged, hard-edged riffs with this kind of harsh, mechanical kind of tone, like it's scraping against your ears. But then that Baby Don't Care, that kind of hook, has a slightly kind of like Screaming Treesy quality to my ears, that kind of sort of laid-back bluesiness. I really like it, and I do think that's one of the things that you mentioned, sort of the almost like piercing the kind of cool character. I think one of the things that Queens have over most their desert rock peers that's helped make them so universal is that they do have this emotional yearning within that kind of context as well. And when they land on it, it's so affecting with the there's got to be some way back to earth melody in Negative Space. Really, like, lands on that. But it also has a guitar melody in there that's underneath it that sounds like a bit like a callback to I Sat by the Ocean. I wonder if that's a bit of intentional. It wouldn't surprise me if there were other callbacks kind of tying it in as well. But it really, to face down your demons, you got to free them refrain in Straight Jacket fitting as well. Like, really sticky. But there is again, a kind of, I think the last 10 years of Queen's records, this trilogy, they have given that more kind of look into the person, as you're saying.
Yeah, and I think with something like Straight Jacket fitting, that's almost the most extreme example of it, because musically, it's got these like doo-wop sensibilities, but then you have these sort of shrieking falsetto parts and the loud to the point of distorted guitar part. The way that all hangs together, it does feel a bit like the wheels are coming off the Cadillac. It's like the band that are cooler than anyone, like you say, showing that raw emotional core. And I think, again, saving up for the end of the record does make for a very rewarding payoff, particularly in that the final 2 minutes, where it kind of goes a bit Wild West. I think that's a really cool touch. And if not for Paper Machete, I'd probably have that as my favourite song of the record. And like I said, that's one of the moments for me where I went, that's the secret Queens thing. That's the thing that makes them so great. So even if the record doesn't grip me throughout, closing on that, I do leave with a sort of general good feeling about it.
You mentioned the sort of the Wild Westy thing. I like, again, the main kind of groove that it has right at the start. There's that sound of like clinking chains that's kind of like fitted into it. And I think there's attention to detail, like the subtle things that are going to make things pop like that. I think they have the best understanding of pure feel of any like 21st century rock band. And when you combine that with a kind of creative ear for bizarre sounds, but when you fit it into that feel, there's the, sort of Made to Parade has that kind of weird keyboard part that's like a fucking like milk bottle melody or something. It's like a weird playful sonic idea, but it has a place in what it's doing there. Like Carnavoyeur, again, brilliantly odd track that only Queens would release as a single. Like that staccato kind of organ flash that interacts with the drum groove in such a cool way. And then it just gets more kind of strange and psychedelic with, Sicily has that kind of hazy Eastern strings kind of basis that's, I love how Queen's records, they feel like they're taking like, sort of 70s classic rock and stuff, like Led Zeppelin records and that, and kind of continually freaking it up and kind of mangling it, as Sam put it. And I think the way that Queens regularly do these kind of quirky experimental records in a way you almost take for granted is really cool for a band where they are. And you mentioned a couple of them, bands who take influence from Queens of Stone Age. Often it's just like, really fun, slick dance rock kind of 4/4 pivot. But the actual article here, take those kind of like robo-disco grooves and fit them into like these really strange, dark journeys of records that aren't just, disposable dancing for half an hour, but are quite heavy, brooding things. I think it's one of a kind, pretty much.
Yeah, I mean, like, again, I appreciate the journey. I do find parts of this record it gets a bit ploddy at times. And like, I don't know if that's, them just wanting to exist in this darker media train. So I think it's something like Made, Fred and Carnivoy as like a 1-2 does, I find, gets a little bit like, I don't know. Sicily, I think, is the best of those kind of more mid-tempo moodier tracks because you get those strings. But whereas that's just that, I think that's kind of more just personal of me finding it a bit dull and a bit lethargic at that point. But it is, again, a deliberate choice to take you on these darker journeys. And I think it is one of the things that, whether I like it or not, I can actually look at it and kind of go, does make for a more interesting record than if it was just, 4/4 dance rock grooves the entire time. Like, and so that I like, that's why I say this album is, interesting more than one I really like.
Yeah, I think it's got a lot. I think it's got a lot to offer as an album. Elliot,
Yeah.
I guess would you say you're kind of feeling on this one in kind of relation to kind of a recent let's say post-classic kind of Queen's output?
Sort of like dead in the middle. So I'd have Like Clockwork and Era Vulgaris above it, but I'd have Villains and Lullabies to Paralyze below it, I think. And I don't think this record is given any favours by the fact it's been out for 5 days at the time of reviewing this.
Yeah, I have I've been listening to it an awful lot just because they are like one of my favourite bands where I really want to dive into records from. It's still pretty fresh.
Well, this is so I've only had, I think, 3 or 4 goes at this record. So, and I have liked it more each time. The first time I really wasn't sure. Now I'm kind of feeling pretty positive about it. So there's a chance that even in a couple of weeks I'll feel more positively about it again. So we'll see. But at the minute, yeah, I think it's a good Queen's record. Moments of brilliance that only they're capable of, but not necessarily not as satisfying as even some of the stuff they've done recently, I don't think.
Fair enough. That's Queens of Stone Age, and in Times New Roman.